Hello and welcome to our webinar, In the Middle of It All, Books for the Middle Grade Reader in All of Us. I'm Maggie Reagan, Senior Editor, Books for Youth. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. To resize the slides, look to the magnifying glass icons located to the left of the slides. There you can increase or decrease the size and select how you'd like the slides to appear. If you lose audio or would like to change the way you're connected to it, look at the bottom of your screen for a circle with 3 dots. Clicking that icon will open a menu with an audio connection option. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the right side of your screen is a control panel with an area at the bottom for Q&A. Simply type your question into the field and click Send. Attendees can see questions asked during the webinar and the answers provided. Links to today's slides were sent directly to you from WebEx at the start of the webinar, but you can also download them at any time by copying the URL on this screen into your web browser. Tomorrow, all attendees will receive a follow-up email containing links to today's slide presentation, certificate of completion, and video recording. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Tae Keller, author of When You Trap a Tiger, Rebecca Stead, author of The List of Things That Will Not Change, and Nic Stone, author of Clean Getaway. First up, we'll hear from Tae Keller. Tae was born and raised in Honolulu, where she grew up on purple rice, spam musubi, and her Halmoni's tiger stories. After high school, she moved in search of snow and now lives in New York City. She is also the author of The Science of Breakable Things. When You Trap a Tiger is her second middle grade novel, and it has received 5-star reviews. Welcome, Tae. The floor is yours.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. Okay, so I'll get into it. When You Trap a Tiger is about a girl named Lily who has always grown up hearing her grandmother, her homony's Korean fairy tales. And these are the stories that I grew up hearing as a kid from my homony. They're about trickster tigers that make dangerous deals with little girls. And like most kids, Lily believes that these stories are just stories. Until one night, when one of these magical tigers visits Lily. And the tiger tells Lily that her homony has some secrets. And one of these secrets is that homony is sick. So the tiger offers Lily one of these dangerous deals. If Lily helps the tiger, then the tiger will heal her homony. And so now Lily has to make a choice. She has always grown up hearing about how these tigers are dangerous and can never be trusted, and yet trusting this tiger is the only way for her to heal her homony.
Thanks so much, Tae. Next up, we will hear from Rebecca Stead. Rebecca is the author of When You Reach Me, which was a New York Times bestseller and winner of the Newbery Medal and the Boston Globe Horn Book Award for Fiction, and Liar and Spy, which was also a New York Times bestseller, and won the Guardian Prize for Children's Fiction and was on multiple state master lists and Best of the Year lists. Her most recent book, Goodbye Stranger, was a Boston Globe Horn Book Honor Book for Fiction and a New York Times bestseller. She is also the author of First Light, which was nominated for many state awards. Take it away, Rebecca.
Hi. I just want to thank everybody who has joined us in this interesting new world, or it's new to me, and it means a lot to connect under the circumstances, and feels like a real honor to be here on my actual pub day, which is today. And so I'm going to just share a little bit about this story and the writing of it. I've always struggled to talk about my books. I can talk about writing until the cows come home, but when it comes to describing my own work, I often get really tongue-tied. So I think maybe the best way to describe this book is by saying that it's in many ways a small story, but it's full of really big feelings. And for me, this was a really comforting story to write. And I hope that it's also a comforting story to read. And it's comforting for me for a couple of different reasons. For one thing, it is really a story about family love. And even though B, our main character, who is 10 for the most part in the story, she's 10 and she's in 5th grade. And her parents are divorced, but her mom and dad take amazing care of her and in some ways of each other. And I just think that she's kind of showered with love throughout the story. And even though she's struggling, that love really ties her, to her sense of herself and kind of connects her to the world. And it also, for me, is comforting. Maybe particularly right now I need this kind of comfort, but this is a story that really acknowledges all kinds of feelings. So B is someone who feels things really strongly, and her feelings sometimes kind of carry her away a little bit. And sometimes they carry her to places where she's doing things that are hurtful to other people. Sometimes she's incredibly joyful, and sometimes she feels these great, powerful feelings of love. But the theme is that her feelings are extra big. And I think that right now it's really great to sort of be able to acknowledge to one another, no matter how old we are, that, grappling with feelings, even when someone to look at you might think that there's, nothing particularly scary about your life or sad about your life, because this is a well taken care of girl. But feelings are a part of everyone's lives, including sort of cloudy feelings. And so that's sort of something that I've been thinking about lately. I'll give you a really quick description of what the book is actually about, since you might be wondering. It tells the story of B's 5th grade year. So B calls that year the year of Dad and Jessie getting married. So as I said, her parents are divorced. They've actually been divorced for a couple of years at the opening of the story. And her dad, who's gay, is marrying his boyfriend, Jessie. And B already loved Jessie. They know each other well. This is not a story about really adjusting to divorce. It's not a story about adjusting to the fact that, your parent is gay. It's about a different kind of adjustment. So B loves Jessie, so the wedding is great news, but her real excitement lies in the fact that Jessie has a daughter in California, and her name is Sonia. She's 10 years old, just like B, and B has never met her, but she has always, always wanted a sister. She and I have that in common, by the way. And because B's feelings come mostly in, as I said, these extra large sizes, she wants Sonia to be her sister in an immediate and powerful way. And Sonia is, in her own situation, living with her mom and her stepdad and her 2 little brothers, and she's in a different place, which is something that B is going to grapple with. So luckily, B has a terrific therapist. Her name is Miriam. And we see them together throughout the story, sort of talking out what's happening in B's life. So I've just given you a quick description of the story. It's sort of the year of planning the wedding, and the book culminates at the wedding itself. But I could have described it in other ways. It's also a friendship story. It's a mother-daughter story. It's an eczema story. Let's hear it for all the eczema people out there. And it's a story about self-forgiveness. And so I'm eager to get into, talking about what makes middle grade, and I hope that's one of the things we'll touch on. But mostly I hope that if you do find your way to this story, that you'll enjoy it and connect with it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Next up, we have Nic Stone. Nic is an Atlanta native and a Spelman College graduate. After working extensively in teen mentoring and living in Israel for several years, she returned to the United States to write full time. Nic's debut novel for young adults, Dear Martin, was a New York Times bestseller and a William C. Morris Award finalist. She is also the author of the teen titles Odd One Out, a novel about discovering oneself and who it is okay to love, which was an NPR Best Book of the Year and a Rainbow Booklist Top 10 selection, and Jackpot, a love-ish story that takes a searing look at economic inequality. Clean Getaway, Nic's first middle grade novel, deals with coming to grips with the pain of the past and facing the humanity of our heroes. Thanks so much for joining us today, Nic.
Hello. Thrilled to be here. I'm glad y'all are here, all 916 of you. I've never done anything like this before, and the fact that I'm talking to 917 people that I can't see is a little wild. So Clean Getaway. Clean Getaway follows an African-American young man named Scoob. He is 11 years old, and his grandmother shows up one day at his house in a Winnebago. There are like slides here because I'm extra and had some added. So his grandmother shows up in a Winnebago just like this one. This is actually the one that I used to model everything, honestly, the bulk of the setting in the book, because most of the book takes place inside this particular vehicle. And this kid has been on lockdown. He has gotten into trouble at school, and his spring break trip was canceled. So his grandmother showing up and giving him this opportunity to kind of get out of the house is what initially makes him decide that he's going to join her on this journey. En route, he finds out that this treasure chest that has been sitting on his grandmother's mantle for years has come along with him on this ride, and she allows him to open it, and inside he finds a map and a picture of the Negro Traveler's Green Book. Now, the Green Book, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's a small booklet. I think it started publishing in the 1930s, and the final edition is the one on the left here in this picture. The other one is from 1950s-ish. So it was a book that was used by African Americans who wanted to be able to travel during the heavily segregated years of our country's history. And it listed all of the places in each state where it was safe to get gas, to stop for food, to lodge, anything you can think of that would require like assistance for a person on a road trip. All of those things were listed in this book so that Black people knew where it was safe to stop. There were even some international locations included, and one of them is touched on in the book. There's a place in Mexico that's in the book that gets touched on in the book. So, sorry. So they go on this road trip, and he begins to discover that things weren't always the way that he's known them. It's a trip across 6 states in the American South. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. I can't count. 5 states. And then they go into Mexico. So 6 places. And as they go, he's discovering that things were a little different when his grandmother was traveling. The interesting thing about his grandmother is that she is white. So he's a Black boy, and she is a white woman. And I modeled this after my own family. The next slide here, this is my older son and his Russian Jewish grandmother. My mother-in-law's name is Olga, and Mama Olga is the best. Like, we absolutely adore her. And while she grew up in Russia, she met my Nigerian father-in-law in university in Russia. Their story of being an interracial couple in the 70s in Russia helped to inspire bits of this one. So it's a book that looks at history. It's a book that looks at family relationships. And it's a book that really, my goal with this book was to kind of reveal the ways in which during pre-adolescence we start coming to grips with the fact that the adults in our lives are not flawless. And I hope that you all enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Nic, and all three of you. We're going to open up the floor now for a Q&A, this panel discussion with Tae, Rebecca, and Nic. And I just want to take a minute to remind everybody listening today that if you have any questions for the three authors, feel free to enter them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And we're going to do our best to get to those today at the end of our panel discussion or after the webinar via email. But we're going to start off by discussing a couple of things with all three of you. So I have a few questions for you. And I think why don't we start off answering these in the order that you presented. So Tae, we're going to have you answer this first question first, and then we'll move on to Rebecca. And then, so let's just talk a little bit about your histories in children's publishing and specifically with middle grade first. The three of you here today have all had very different histories. Tae, your second book for middle graders is just released, so you're a relative newcomer. Rebecca's a veteran of middle grade fiction, and Nic, as we've all just learned, you've written for teens and young adults, and you're now making your middle grade debut. With all of these perspectives in mind, can you all talk a little bit about your experiences and what drew you to a middle grade audience in the first place?
Sure. So my first published book, The Science of Breakable Things, was the first time that I had tried to write middle grade. Before that, I was writing a lot of practice books in YA, and I was finding that my voice in young adult was very walled off, and I think that's because when I was a teenager, I was very guarded and I was very cautious with my feelings. But in middle school, that was before I had kind of learned to put these walls up, and so I didn't have this emotional shield. I was very raw, and I felt everything so deeply and so intensely. And that made it kind of hard to live through middle school. But now, as a writer going back, I think when I write from a middle grade voice, I'm able to tap into that vulnerability again, and I'm able to be more honest with my feelings. And I think that that is kind of what is so amazing about middle grade in general. It's a very open, vulnerable age, and the books that come out of this age group are able to connect with middle schoolers and with adults, because I think we all know what it was like to be in that time before we learned to guard our feelings. Yeah, what about you guys?
This is Rebecca. So I feel like I relate to what was just said, because I feel like I also felt much more open when I was, younger, before age 13 maybe. And I've never actually really tied that to the fact that this is the age group I write for. I've always known that my memory is really tied to my younger years. And I wonder if, in a way, that guard that does go up for a lot of us, I don't know, I was going to say especially girls, but that may just be a knee-jerk thing that I was going to say, and it may be absolutely wrong, and this could be universal. I think that there's a kind of self-consciousness that kicks in very powerfully at age 13 or so. And so, maybe I had such a good guard that I can't even remember, but I actually don't have strong memories of high school, which is strange. So I have only written middle grade. You very generously said I was a veteran, but I've only written, a handful of books in the years that I've been writing. But I do feel like I have a clear connection to voice and emotion, and sort of for this age. And once you start spending time with readers who are 8 to 12, say, it's really hard to imagine writing for any other group, I have found, because this is such a sort of group of blooming minds and hearts, and these kids are generally leaning forward, and so eager to share their connections to the stories and their experience. And I went to a school not long ago where a kid was like practically levitating in the first row because I said that I grew up with divorced parents and that I was an only child. And I mean, he came up to me afterwards and said, I never imagined we'd have so much in common. And I mean, these are the fundamental things that form us, I think. And it's lovely to write for a group that is, you know, open-hearted. And I think that it allows me as a writer to be open-hearted, which leads to my best work, hopefully.
So I waited to go last. Yeah, I waited to go last just because, like, this is a very new space for me. I started writing middle grade partially because Jason Reynolds told me to, partially because I have small children and they can't read my YA. My second grader is now reading Clean Getaway, which is like basically the highlight of my life. I'm like, yes, I have done it. I can rest now. And then the third piece is that I just kept getting requests from teachers for a book like Dear Martin, but one they could hand to their fourth and fifth graders. So for me, moving into this space was more out of a series of practical things than suddenly feeling like these were the stories I needed to be telling instead. I find middle grade very challenging to write. Like, I enjoy it. There's a purity about it that I really like. Like, and when I say purity, I'm not talking about anything like funky or weird. I mean, in the sense of there's like a purity of heart. And even when a kid is doing something bad, they still get to be a kid. You know, like, it's not like in YA where if you're 14 or 15 and you do something wrong, you can be tried as an adult. Like, that's just, just a totally different, younger people, pre-adolescents are perceived differently than adolescents and teenagers are. So while I enjoy that part of it, like, not being able to cuss is hard in these books. Another piece that I find difficult is, like, staying true to the pre-emotional wildness that happens in the thick of, like, being a teenager, where everybody is super, it's like we all turn inward when we hit 14 or 15. And I'm really good at channeling that in YA. So trying to channel being other-centered has been interesting, but I am very much enjoying it, and I will definitely continue to write in the space, even just for the challenge, because I do like having to approach story in a different way. But it's great. And yeah, the kids are really great. I will never forget, I was in an elementary school while I was on tour for Clean Getaway, and the kids were just like, "Oh, ma'am, you cute." And that's all I needed. Like, I was good after that.
So what kind of readers were all of you as tweens, and would you have been interested in reading the books that you're writing now? Rebecca, why don't you kick this one off?
Oh, yeah, I would have been into this book, but in a way, this book is exploring a lot of my, specific personal issues. I think that we all have our internal wells of sort of material, and in a way, I think that when you've written a few books, you begin to see that you're kind of writing the same themes, maybe. I never think about theme when I'm writing, but I often can recognize them when I look back at a book that I've finished. And, I write a lot about being connected to the world and sort of safety and family. And even if it's a fantasy or it's like a science fiction book, those tend to be the things at the center of my resolution, is a feeling of acceptance and connectedness. And I think that I looked for that a lot as a kid. I loved reading books like Norma Klein's Mom, the Wolf, Man, and Me, about, a kid whose mom has a boyfriend. I mean, I love things that reflected me. I mean, like everyone, right? We all want to see ourselves in story. And so I was lucky in that I was reading in the 1970s when I was an elementary school reader. It was 70s. And so that was kind of in a lot of, I think, I mean, I'm not a critic. I haven't read a lot of history, but it seems to me like that was the birth of a lot of sort of a more truth-telling voice in books for kids. And instead of trying to write books where things were smooth or sweet and all, you know, kind of like the happy, easy childhood that we all wish our kids had, the books were acknowledging the reality of being a child, which is that even if your setup is fantastic and you're, you know, everything seems easy and you have everything you need and you have love, there's still a lot to struggle with. And so I loved books that acknowledged that. And it was one of the big ways that I kind of came to know myself as a person, to be honest, was by, you know, this wasn't something I talked to my friends about, you know, I don't know, when I was 11, I didn't, you know, bring that stuff up with my friends, but it was almost like, you know, like bat sonar, I sometimes say, where sort of by bouncing off of the internal lives of invented characters and stories I was reading, I was able to kind of understand myself better. So, and I could honestly, I also, having read When You Trap a Tiger and having read Clean Getaway, both of those were books that I also would have absolutely, you know, just been all over as a kid and probably would have read and reread, because they too, you know, reflect authentic internal experience as well as real story, you know, an engaging story where you're reading to find out what happens.
So I'll go next. It's Nick. I can't say. I guess I maybe would have read books like the ones I'm writing now, but like if they existed, I had no idea, because from the books that I was handed in my adolescence never had me in them. And if they had me in them, it was in a historical context. So, Bud Not Buddy, for instance, I love Christopher Paul Curtis, like, and I loved his books, and I love Mildred D. Taylor's books, but they were different than what I knew in my like 90s contemporary life and setting. So Roll Up Under Hear My Cry was great, but like there were things about it that I couldn't necessarily connect with just because I wasn't living in that time and I wasn't having those same experiences. So I was actually reading really intense adult sci-fi when I was in middle school. My favorite author was Michael Crichton, and I ate his books like Tyrannosaurus is eating people, I guess. Like it just was a thing that I really found fascinating. My favorite book was Sphere, and I think part of my love for Sphere had to do with the way it took things that I was familiar with and bent them into new shapes. So I try to do that now, but without the science fiction element. It's just like taking truth and presenting it in a way that is recognizable, but maybe you're seeing it from a different angle. It's similar to this is actually part of the reason, while I love a list of things that will not change, one of the first middle grade books I read as an adult was When You Reach Me. And like the way Rebecca plays with time in that book is something that reminded me of the way Michael Crichton played with like science and even like alien technology. And I think that those are the things that I was looking for as a middle school kid who often was feeling out of place. I was like bullied for things, and I was really smart, but I was afraid of people knowing I was smart because of bullying and things like that. Like having those and these kinds of books, I think, would have been helpful.
I am sitting here just feeling so lucky to listen to you guys because, I mean, your books are amazing. I really look up to you, and I definitely would have read your books as a kid and loved it. I think also as a kid, I really loved fantasy as well, especially kind of not necessarily fantasy worlds, but contemporary portal fantasies where, a kid's just living their everyday life and then they can escape. When I was little, I was very much a believer in magic, and I would, make up little spells to cast, and I would make potions and leave little gifts for fairies. And I think that when I reached middle school, that was a time when I had to start to let go of that belief in magic. And letting go of that felt kind of like a real true loss. And it felt like I was mourning that belief and wonder. And part of coming of age, I think, is learning to find magic like that in other ways in the world. That maybe magic didn't exist the way that you wanted it to. Maybe you can't cast a spell to fix all your problems, but there are other ways to find that wonder. And whether that's in relationships with family and friends, or in science and storytelling or books, I think that when I write, I'm always trying to think about that idea of finding magic in the real world.
So all three of your books feature characters facing family and emotional issues, and these are topics that can sometimes get heavy. And I think that all of you exhibit great trust in the abilities of your readers to navigate these topics. And I'm just wondering what words you have for people who are concerned about a middle grade audience's ability to handle the more difficult subjects. Nic, we can start with you on this one. I think you haven't gone first yet.
Yeah, honestly, my biggest piece of advice is to drill back down into what it felt like to be in middle school. 12 to 18 are probably my most vivid. They are the years I remember most vividly, and I don't think that we ever lose the ability to tap back into what it felt like to be 11 or 12 years old. It's such a pivotal time that if you look back at what was your favorite TV show when you were 11? What kind of books did you like to read? What did you like to do for fun? All of those things will give clues as to not only what type of person, what type of kid you were, but what you were able to handle. I was dealing with some really heavy, intense stuff at 11 and 12. And a lot of it just helped to make me into the person that I am now. But I think that we honestly do kids, and I say this as a mother as well, my sons are 7 and 3. I think we do kids a disservice by trying to shield them too much from, I guess, the truth of the world. And yes, there are ways to reveal that truth that aren't going to be traumatic, which is, I think, honestly what these books do. I think they reveal the truth of the world to kids in a way that they can grapple with. I would rather hand my kid a book about racism, or a book about divorce, or a book about, a kid who is interacting with something she's afraid of for the sake of saving something that she loves, than, shove them into a situation where they have to face these things. You know what I mean? So for me, I would say the most important thing we can do as adults is not forget what it was like to be young.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are kids who are dealing with these heavy things and who are looking for something to help guide them through it. And it's not like kids don't have access to the world, right? They have the internet at their fingertips. And in a lot of cases, I think these books can help guide them in a way that's more thoughtful and can be more helpful than, whatever they're going to happen to find online. So in that way, I think it's important to have books that address these things. And also something that I've been really struck by when I visit schools is that kids have such a good ability to self-select. They know very well what their boundaries are and when they're willing to push those boundaries and when they're not. So I think just being clear about what a book is about explaining it in the summary or the first few chapters, or having a teacher or librarian or parent talk to a kid about what the content of a book is before they start to read it, a kid will know if that's something that they're interested in exploring. So it's really just, we can open that door for them and they can choose whether to close the door or whether to walk through it.
I completely agree with everything you guys both just said. This is Rebecca. And, I think that a lot of the time, and I'm trying to think of a way to say this like gently, but I think that a lot of the time when people are trying to sort of shelter kids from hard, truths about the world, I think that it's almost like a kind of fantasy that they want to maintain for themselves, that kids aren't living in the world and that kids aren't struggling privately. And I think, honestly, for me, I had so many, wild, weird thoughts as a kid. I'm guessing that almost every single person who is listening right now had really deep, strong, and wild, imaginings and fears and thoughts and, all of that as a kid. And I just find it almost chilling, the idea that we want to then as adults kind of pretend that childhood is simple. And, I'm not into writing, horror, although there are a lot of kids who really enjoy horror. But I think that to create a book that's going to be a really meaningful reading experience for a kid, or I should say one kind of book that will be meaningful for some kids, it's just so necessary to sort of, meet your reader in a place where you are authentic and you are acknowledging, some crappy things about the world, and that is, I think that to avoid, the complexities of the world is basically a form of, it's like your why can't I think of that word? It's condescension. Thank you. And that is the thing. I've been told I have an overdeveloped sense of justice. In fact, my mother was told that in the parent-teacher conference when I was in 4th grade by my teacher. And so, but it actually makes me mad. So maybe I'm overreacting, but I feel like it is really wrong to treat kids as if they are not part of, the complexities of the world. And it's almost, like you live in the world with a kid where there are scary things, and to sit next to that child and say, what? I don't see those scary things you're talking about, is almost like chilling to me. So I really am a firm believer that we have to bring in and address, and some of the hard stuff. And I'd rather bring it in and talk about how to get through it than avoid it, because I think it makes for a stronger book, but I also think it makes for a much more meaningful experience for young readers.
I love that.
Oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just totally agreeing. Kids are people too. They're living in this world just like all of us. So I wholeheartedly agree.
And we did have one comment from the Q&A, Rebecca, that I just wanted to bring up right now. And somebody says, thank
Sure.
you for including a therapist in your middle grade book. And they said, I feel that it's very important to remove the stigma of seeing a therapist. And that's something that you don't see a lot in middle grade. I just wanted to address that as well.
Oh my gosh. I wish I'd had a therapist like Miriam when I was a kid. I mean, just someone who you can trust and who you don't have the parental relationship with, and who you can just be yourself with, and someone who can, what Miriam is doing, I think, in that story is just acknowledging these feelings and kind of acknowledging the completely universal truth that we all have really strong feelings, and that a lot of the time when, I'll just speak personally, when I'm reacting in a way that I don't like, it's often because I'm misinterpreting my own feeling. Like, I think I'm mad, but really I'm hurt. Or, you know, and I think that it even as adults, we struggle to figure this stuff out, right? And to not be reactive. And I think that it's really great to say to kids, you have these powerful, powerful feelings. I'm always saying that I think that young kids, you know, they don't have a ton of experience in the world, but they have a lot of experience when it comes to traveling emotional territory, a lot. And it's easy to forget that. So I actually really loved writing the scenes with Miriam because it was just like a personal pleasure to write scenes where a kid is being told, you know, yes, you felt that, and, you know, you shouldn't have thrown that bag of candy that you threw, but let's, you know, but it's okay. We're going to accept, you know, the feeling. We're going to talk about the feeling. And, you know, that's, for me, was sort of one of the keys to this story.
I'm going to pull out a couple of questions from the audience now because there's a lot of great ones in here. So if you guys are listening, keep them coming. You can pop them into that Q&A panel on your screen. But this is from Sherry, who says she's a big fan of middle grade fiction. And she's wondering if you find writing novels for this age group freeing insofar as that it has a greater range of situations, emotions, and life changes. She says that it seems to her that YA novels have a much narrower range of choices and storylines.
Sure. I guess I'd probably be the person to answer this since I'm writing both. I don't find YA more narrow. And I don't know. I think that, like, they are both universes unto themselves because individuals are universes unto themselves. And, like, each person at each age is a universe unto him, her, or themselves. The key thing about stories are characters. Like, the people are really what the story is about. So I think that as long as you are getting to the emotional core of whatever it is you're writing, you can drop a character of any age into any situation and find something that you didn't know you were looking for. I love writing both. And I think when I try to do adult, I'll probably love that too. YA is an interesting space with regard to the people in it, but with regard to the stories and the things that you can do, the conventions you can use, it's just as broad to me as middle grade is.
Someone has called back, Rebecca, to what you said earlier on about what makes middle grade, and they want to know the answer to that question. What does make middle grade besides the age of the protagonist?
Wait, I thought somebody else was going to answer this. So, I mean, it sort of goes back to what Nic just said. I mean, it's the characters, you know, that drive the story, and the character, for me at least, is what defines the territory of the story. I feel like the territory of a book is more or less the territory of your characters. And so that's like physical territory, emotional territory, you know, sort of what's happening in the story, but also what how the story is being processed by the main character. So you can write a book for adults about 12-year-olds, but that's not going to be obviously a middle grade book. It has to be that it's almost like the story is processed by, I'm probably not saying this very well, but feel free to jump in, guys, by a younger, by a young person, right? I mean, it's about the way the story is being told. And so one way to do that, and I've done this not every time, but a few times, is by using the first person, right? Because then you have your story told through a young mind. And that is a very clear, almost kind of shortcut to making sure that your territory is middle grade, because you're not venturing beyond the point of view of a middle grade mind. But you can also do it, obviously, in, using other points of view, with third person, and most commonly. And so I feel like you just have to watch. You have to kind of watch the voice, and you have to pay attention. And I think that it's kind of a know it when you see it kind of experience, and a lot of the nuance happens in revision. Do you guys find that? I mean, sometimes I have things that just seem outside of the voice or outside of the age of my voice, and I have to kind of, something that has to be fixed as I'm working on the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. Go ahead, Tae.
I find that my editor has a really good ear for middle grade too. So if I have strayed away from the voice, she's very good at pinpointing that and saying, no, I don't think that a kid would say that. But yeah, thank you for articulating that answer, because I'm not sure that I could have done that, but that was a great way to describe it.
Yeah, I want to add to this, though, and say that, something interesting, just honestly, literally from the completely opposite end here, from, the marketing and the publicity end of it, one of the things that I have seen as a person who is also writing young adult fiction, something that is making my middle grade different from my young adult is the fact that, my middle grade has to appeal to parents more than the YA does. So there's this interesting direct to audience line I have with YA that isn't quite the same in the middle grade space. So it's almost like a dual responsibility where you're telling a truth that you remember from being young to a young person, but you're also telling that truth in a way that young person's parents will be okay with them receiving to an extent. Mm-hmm. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree with that. It's definitely a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not a bad, I don't think it's a bad thing. But, the question of who, you do think when you're writing middle grade, who is going to be the person to hand this book to my reader? Because a lot of the time it will be coming from an adult. Now, there are certainly middle grade readers who go to the library and pick their own books, plenty of them, but much of the time that book is being handed to them by someone. And yeah, I actually have not really talked about this very much, and so I don't have a lot of formulated thoughts about it, but it's absolutely a consideration in my mind. And it is, I think, although I haven't published YA, it makes so much sense, Nic, that it's, it's different.
Yeah.
Well, people are also very curious to know who all of you are reading.
Reading now?
Yeah.
Ooh. I find that these days I read a lot of stuff that's not out yet. I'm constantly reading books that are upcoming so that I can shout about them. But let's see. In the middle grade space, I am really enjoying Kwame and Ballia. The first book in the Tristan Strong series came out in, I think, early October last year. Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky. And I am deeply emotionally invested in this series because it looks at mythology from an African American perspective, and it is absolutely fascinating. And I also loved, no, Jason Reynolds doesn't need promotion from anybody, but what he did in Look Both Ways with this like middle grade short story collection is basically what it is. It blew me away, and I loved because it's a thing where you can take it in chunks. You can pluck a story and study it in a classroom, and then move on to a book that you have to teach. Things like that. I liked the format of that book and what he is doing. I'm trying to think. You guys totally can jump in.
Yeah. So I'm rereading Kat Ye's The Way to Be, which Kat Ye is so good. She's one of my favorite middle grade authors. And From the Desk of Zoe Washington, I just read that, which is amazing. I read it in one sitting. And then a plug for an adult book that I'm currently obsessed with that just came out. It's called The Sharks in the Time of Saviors. It is about a Hawaiian family, and that was really cool to read because I haven't read a lot of books set in Hawaii, and that's where I'm from, and it was great to read something from a Native perspective. And it kind of takes Hawaiian mythology and weaves it into this contemporary family story, and it's just so cool. I feel like I can't say too much about it without kind of spoiling some stuff, but I highly recommend it.
Maybe we can put these titles like in the notes somewhere because I don't have a pen, but I want to be recording what you guys are saying. Mm-hmm. So in addition to these two delicious books by my co-panelists, I have recently read some new middle grade. I also just read From the Desk of Zoe Washington and loved it. It's also a book close to my heart because I used to be a public defender, and in part it's about criminal justice, although the public defender in this story is not a very good one, sadly. But it's a great book and a great example also of, what we were just talking about, sort of a kid's interaction with what a lot of people would consider, an adult corner of the world. But the truth is that, as we just said, these things touch everyone. I also read pretty recently, Leah Henderson wrote a book called The Magic in Changing Your Stars, which is a fantastic sort of time travel back to early 20th century Harlem. And it's a great family love story. And it was originally, we shared a pub date. So it was to be pub today, but I believe it's been pushed back. But whether it's out today or not, you should look for that one. It's called The Magic in Changing Your Stars. I also just read Chirp by Kate Messner. And also really good book, really thoughtful and lovely. And once again, sort of facing an issue which a lot of us would love to imagine kids don't deal with, which is sort of inappropriate attention from an adult in the kid's life. And it is sort of the journey of the main character to find her voice and to actively figure out who are her helpers, sort of who she can trust. And on the adult side, I have to say, I have struggled to read a little bit lately, but I'm very distracted. I'm reading my first ever Lee Child book. I don't read books like that very often, but it is not because they're not good. I just tend not to. So it's almost like watching a movie, which is, as we know, fun. Oh, I know. I also just read an adult book that I really loved called Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. So I recommend that one also.
Great. And I just want
I'll try to put these in the notes.
Everybody will, the Q&As, those will be sent out to everyone, and you will have a chance to answer questions after the fact. So if we did not get to your question, the attendees will have a chance to answer it. So you'll be able to put everything in an email, and we can write everything down afterwards. So we'll be able to do a little book list roundup afterwards.
Great.
And I just wanted to wrap things up with one final question, which is that it's commonly said that while YA books must contain hope in some way, middle grade has to end with it. So I just wanted to get all of your thoughts on this statement, and I want to know how you as creators find ways to create hope for your audience, especially in a world that can, especially lately, often feel very bleak.
Ooh.
No pressure.
I don't like rules. Like, so everybody knows who's talking right now because of what I just said. But I don't really like this idea that, like, something has to end. So, and I do think that there's truth to the fact that middle grade books typically do end with hope, but I think that's just the nature of the age of the character that you're writing about. Like, I think that's just like there is a light at the end of the tunnel when you're 11. When you're for most people, there's a light when you're 11, when you're 12, because there's still so much life to be lived. So there is hope, but I don't know that it necessarily always looks like what people expect it to.
I totally agree with that, Nic. This is Rebecca. I also don't like rules about writing, but and I often, like, when people say, what's the moral of your story, and people do ask that. And I always say, I don't write toward a moral, but I do always write moral characters. It's more about what's happening inside the characters in your story. And that is sort of that's what I think about. It's really the only thing I think about when I'm writing. And so I kind of feel the same way about hope, which is, I'm not writing to give anybody hope, but I am writing, as much as I can to tell a story that says something about how I experience the world. And I think that, we are by nature hopeful. Maybe writers are just particularly optimistic because we think we can, like, write these books and have that be our job, hopefully, for some years to come. I mean, it's sort of, my editor once said to me, if you think about it, writers are always saying, like, oh, they may act humble, but in a way they're like the least humble people because look what they're, acting like they can do, kind of. But I sort of feel like I'm a hopeful person and my characters tend to have some hope. And this particular story doesn't end with, like, I actually, none of my books end with, like, a big bow. I always feel disappointed by that. I don't like stories that end with everything tied up. I like knowing that the road ahead is going to have, like, some stuff in the way and that there's going to be some mess, but that, like, my character has either the internal resources or maybe internal resources with a little help from the people in his or lives to kind of make their way on that road. But for some reason I shy away from this idea that you have to write a hopeful ending too.
Yeah, I think, well, long before I was writing, these published books, I was writing for myself, and writing for me was always a coping mechanism. So my stories are about these problems that I'm having or these things that I'm afraid of, and I write to tell myself that it's going to be okay. So I think all my stories are naturally moving towards this idea that life can be really hard, but ultimately there's a lot of joy and wonder in life too, and things are going to be okay and you'll get through it. And hopefully that's something that people connect to. I know that when I read middle grade, that's a feeling that I really connect to.
That's really beautiful. I actually think that that's probably true for a lot of us. That I know that I, to some extent, am writing fantasy, meaning like my personal fantasy of, you know, the many ways that life can go for people. And often it is a kind of self-consoling thing.
Mm-hmm.
That was like a perfect ending spot.
On that note, thank you so much. You guys, this was all wonderful, and you've all been great. It was great having you all today. And let's give it up again for Tae, Rebecca, and Nic. Thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yay!
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who is with us here.
Yeah.
We appreciate y'all coming.
Tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's slide presentation, certificate of completion, and video recording. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit www.booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming new ones. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Booklist Reader, where Booklist contributors post daily about all things books and library land. Booklist has a digital edition of the magazine, which you can connect to your subscription online. This format pairs the page-by-page reading experience of print with the convenience of online access, and it's included free with all Booklist subscriptions. If you're not yet a subscriber, you can take advantage of the special webinar offer to get print, online, digital, and archive access to Booklist for only $99. If you're tired of waiting to see the latest copy of Booklist or worrying it might get misplaced on its way to you, you can now purchase an extra copy for your library for just $50. To learn more, please visit bit.ly/booklist for $50. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and one more huge thank you to our sponsors, Random House Children's Books. This concludes today's webinar.